There is hope for your hopeless situation, because Robert Moore has mapped the territory of what you are going through and experiencing. Because if you feel like your old identities, the old roles and anchors that you had that gave you purpose and meaning in the world have fallen away, and if you find yourself in an in-between place, a lost place where you can't quite connect to things in the way that you used to, but something new hasn't yet emerged or been born, and so you find yourself in the in-between, then this video is for you, because we're going to cover the territory of this through Robert Moore's three-phase structure, and hopefully we're going to find a solution somewhat through this book here that may be a way in which you can begin to come out of this territory. And so Robert Moore describes this basic threefold structure that we go through, which he calls the archetype of initiation. And so there's the good news already, is you're not just going mad, you're not just depressed, but actually you can map an understanding that you're going through an archetypal journey, through an archetype of initiation, which can hopefully give a little bit of hope already to understanding that this is part of a psychological transformational process. And so there's a threefold structure. We essentially live in the profane space. This is just the world that you know, the things you're familiar with, the relationships that you have, the work that you do, the purpose and meaning, all of your hobbies, all of those things, but they anchor you in the world. You feel like there's a continuity in your experience. But something happens. It's like something begins to withdraw from the external, and you begin to find yourself just in a kind of lost space, almost like a mist has descended on you, and you're trying to navigate something unknown. And so Robert Moore would say you enter the belly of the wow in the second phase, which is the liminal space. So you go into this space where the old world, the profane space, breaks down. The kind of inner scaffolding and foundations are rocked, and you end up destabilized for what can be months and what truly can be years. And I have been in this phase before for years. And so this is very close to my heart, you could say, in some ways. And hopefully then what happens is, through going into the belly of the whale, or going into the unconscious, or going into the deep, whatever kind of analogy you want to use, you emerge with some gold. You emerge with some kind of inner transformation. Maybe there's old, discarded, rejected parts of yourself that you've had to recover. Maybe your identity in some way was limited and you had to expand to include more. Or maybe you just had some kind of fundamental shift in consciousness in the way that you related to the world. Maybe you were very narcissistic and now something shifted and now you relate to the world in a different way, maybe a more intimate way. But something shifts, and then you come back out of this into the third phase, which is simply to re-enter profane space again, to re-enter the world. But you don't enter it how you were. You've transformed. Something's fundamentally shifted. But that's what happens when it works, and it doesn't always work. And that's what Robert Moore calls chronic liminality. That is when we get stuck in the belly of the whale. We get stuck in this liminal space, this middle phase of transformation, and we don't move through in the way that we should. And there's many ways in which we can kind of keep ourselves stuck here. So one of the obvious ways is we simply resist this process. We resist it with everything we can. We might begin to medicate ourselves in some capacity. And I don't just mean going to your GP and getting some drugs because you're depressed and you want to feel happy, but I mean also dissociating with technology, or taking other kinds of drugs, or drinking, or something, because you're feeling lost. And so you begin to medicate your soul, you begin to deal with these inner stirrings. But as James Hillman warned, and kind of pointing over there because there's a couple of his books, if you treat symptom, then you also treat away soul, because symptom is a royal road that leads down into soul, or simply a deeper relationality, purpose, or meaning, should I say, that you connect to something fundamentally deeper than this surface level that you've perhaps been operating on. But if this depression is indicating that something fundamentally is disconnected and we need a new connection, if we treat that away to continue with the old patterns, we don't allow the restructuring of our personality, and so we're going to remain stuck in this place. Another way is we begin to just simply cling to these old ways, the old roles that we played. Because the risk here is we do what Jung called restoration of the persona. We almost do this patchwork, because if you imagine that the persona essentially has gone through a deconstruction process because it didn't serve us anymore, we begin to try and pick up the fragments. This isn't some kind of Japanese process where we build back together with gold. This is a process of kind of sellotaping it back onto ourselves, and it's all distorted. It's more Frankenstein than it is golden pottery, right? And we're just simply holding on through sheer will because we're struggling to let go. But if you're honest with yourself, you can already notice there's no going back. You can't cling to an old interest that has already passed and gone. And so if I grab a quote from this book just to describe this a little bit better, this is when a person receives the call, but they really do not want to go through with the whole death and rebirth experience. So they get some crutches, they lie down until the urge toward real transformation goes away. In other words, they pray or go to church until the urge to confront the inner monster subsides. And so there's this bracing, this holding on, this restoration of the persona, this Frankensteining of ourselves, of grabbing hold of these old pieces and putting them back on again. Because we're afraid. We're afraid of the unknown. We're afraid of descending into the unconscious. We're afraid also of confronting ourselves. But again, the honesty piece. It's too late. It's too late. It's gone, right? Like, no matter how much you try and grab hold of this thing in the way that you used to, it just doesn't mean anything anymore. And if you're in this phase, you know what I mean. You get it. It's a true experience. And if you carry on clinging on, you're going to lead into nihilism. And so that's some of the ways in which we begin to avoid this process, this old clinging or this medicating of the experience to anesthetize our soul, to just numb out, to dissociate, to not confront what needs to be confronted. And in Joseph Campbell terms, perhaps we're refusing the call. There's something we're being called towards here, and we're refusing it. We're restoring the persona. We're holding on. We're bracing because it's frightening. And it makes sense that it's frightening because these things that we anchor to can be called external unifying centers, which is really some of the theory of this book here. These unifying centers, they contain parts of us. They give us purpose. They give us some meaning. They give us some direction. They give us some continuity of being mirrored and seen. But what I'm explaining here is it makes sense why it's scary. Because these are essentially anchors into the world. And we've untethered from these anchors. And we're wondering, well, who the hell am I if I'm not that? But not only if I'm not that, it's who am I in relationship to perhaps my friends? Perhaps in this relationship? Perhaps just all of these old hobbies that you had? Who am I to work anymore? Just the question in general, who am I? Because in a way you could look at this breakdown process as what you could imagine as being called forced disidentification. There's a part of our psyche that gets identified with the persona, and through this crisis moment, we're forced to disidentify with the persona and come back to soul to wonder, who really am I in my depths? And this challenges us, it confronts us with that question. But it's not easy, because we don't know what we're going to find. And so there's this experience of self-betrayal that happens, that each time you go and do that thing that doesn't interest you, that just doesn't give you anything anymore, you experience it as a self-betrayal. And that's one of the first ways in which you can begin to really connect to the way out of this. Because the self-betrayal is really indicating something to you. Not all shame is bad. If you're doing a behavior that betrays something fundamental to you, it makes sense why some shame's going to come in. It's healthy shame. You could call it progressive shame. The shame wants to move you forwards in life towards something better. But if you're continuing to cling for survival personality needs, for false self needs, to old false belonging, then it's a self-betrayal, and it's indicating, it's making you feel crappy because it's trying to create a fundamental shift in you. And so one of the first ways in which this builds is the essential sense of self-betrayal just grows and grows and grows until eventually it grows into its own beast that's big enough to kind of dislodge the part of you that's clinging and holding on. And it says, I just can't live this way anymore. This is exhausting. I'm sick of it. Something needs to change. And there's a moment of surrender that comes in. Eventually, the self-betrayal becomes big enough that you just can't live with it anymore. And you surrender. And finally, maybe turn towards something new or turn within. But the second way is through internal and external unifying centers. This is some of the theory from this book here, and let me pull out a quote. Each center in a different way facilitates the I-self relationship, supporting the expression of authentic personality. Furthermore, as each stage of life is supported and held by the appropriate, empathic, external unifying center, the active interaction with the external unifying center conditions the formation of an inner representation or inner model of that center, an internal unifying center. But why is this dense theory important to this? Well, it's important because if your old unifying centers have broken down and your anchors have disappeared and you're feeling untethered, you need to perhaps begin to engage with something external again. So there's this element of having to recover and develop and come into relationship with your own unconscious and different parts of yourself in new, authentic ways. But there's also this external sense. What's calling you externally to come into relationship with something in a different way? Is there an old desire, an old longing that you had to repress, you had to get rid of in childhood because it wasn't allowed, that's calling you back through again? And so if you begin to kind of think, okay, truly, what are the things I'm interested in? Where is that little inkling of desire? Because I know what it's like. When you're in this liminal space, your energy, your libido doesn't flow anywhere. It doesn't have anywhere to go. But perhaps if you begin to funnel it into something that has a little bit of a call, a little bit of a desire behind it, it might start off small and you may have to keep flowing into it for a while, but you might notice it begins to contain you. You begin to enjoy it, in fact. It begins to give you some purpose and meaning again, and you begin to find a new anchor point, a new structure that begins to come through. And so it's not just an internal process, but it can be an external process which facilitates an inner development, which is the internalization aspect. But what happens is, as you connect to this, finally that libido begins to find somewhere to flow again. It's like if we just keep cooped up, locked up in our kind of cave, in our den, in our cabin, then we're not relating, we're not rubbing up against the external world again. Because sometimes we discover these parts of ourselves through the friction of outside world interactions. So imagine something's fundamentally shifted within. There's perhaps a conscience, a different way of relating that's less narcissistic. How do we know that something shifted unless we meet something, engage with something in the outside world? It's through that we begin an interaction and a dynamic where we can come into relationship with something new. Your libido begins to find a place to land again, and you begin to feel contained in a new way, and your anchors begin to land again, and you begin to discover how you have shifted, how you have changed. And so sometimes it isn't just that we need to discover something in our unconscious. Sometimes there's this chronic liminality aspect that as we begin to engage and rub up against the external world again, that friction and that internalization begins to create new anchor points again. And so as you can see, there's this basic threefold structure of moving from the profane space into the liminal space, going down into the belly of the whale, Joseph Campbell terms, or the unconscious, or deep into the cave, the deep recesses, whatever it is. There's a desire to discover something, our discarded parts, our old longings, the parts we've had to repress and get rid of, that desire to be recalled, and that the persona has been fractured, has been destabilized and distorted in a way for a new container to build for you, for something new to come through, to be birthed, to emerge, that maybe needs relationships in the external world to facilitate it, so that you begin to know yourself in a different way through these relationships and uncover parts of yourself that perhaps before were shamed, were rejected, they weren't allowed. And as long as we surrender to that, we don't try and Frankenstein ourselves, then we can begin to recover these aspects of ourselves, and we can begin to come out of this liminal space, finally. And so I hope something here has been helpful, and if you're in this space, just know you're not alone, however difficult it is. So I'll see you in the next video.